When a narcissist realizes you are gone for good, the psychological shift that occurs is often misunderstood. Many people assume this moment triggers deep regret, emotional awakening, or a desire for genuine change. In reality, the process is far more structured, predictable, and rooted in the narcissist's internal dynamics rather than in authentic emotional loss. To understand what actually happens, it is necessary to first examine how narcissists perceive relationships. Unlike healthy relational frameworks, where connection is based on mutual respect, empathy, and emotional reciprocity, narcissistic relationships are fundamentally utilitarian. The partner is not experienced as a fully independent individual, but as a source of psychological regulation. This includes validation, attention, admiration, and even emotional reactions such as conflict or distress. All of these function as what is clinically referred to as narcissistic supply. Because of this, the narcissist does not interpret your presence in terms of love as you understand it. Instead, your presence becomes integrated into their internal system as something predictable, accessible, and controllable. Over time, especially in toxic or cyclical relationships, a pattern is established. You withdraw, they react, you return, the system stabilizes. This repetition reinforces a cognitive expectation that you are not truly leaving, only temporarily disrupting the pattern. When you finally leave without returning, without explanation, without emotional closure, and most importantly, without continued engagement, the initial reaction is not emotional devastation, it is cognitive dissonance. The narcissist's internal model of reality is disrupted. The expected outcome, your return, does not occur. This creates a psychological inconsistency that demands resolution. At this stage, the narcissist typically attempts re-engagement. These attempts are often subtle and calculated rather than overtly emotional. You may see neutral messages, vague apologies, or seemingly casual check-ins. In some cases, the communication may appear mature or self-aware. However, from a psychological standpoint, these behaviors are not driven by genuine accountability. They are exploratory. The narcissist is testing whether access to you still exists. If you respond, even minimally, the previous relational structure can be reactivated. The narcissist regains a sense of control and the cycle continues. However, if there is no response, if silence is maintained consistently, something more significant begins to occur. Silence removes the narcissist's ability to regulate themselves through you. Without access to your reactions, emotions, or attention, their primary source of external stabilization is cut off. This leads to what can be described as a disruption in narcissistic supply. The absence of this supply does not immediately produce sadness in the conventional sense. Instead, it creates internal instability. This instability can manifest as restlessness, irritation, or increased attempts to seek alternative sources of validation. In many cases, the narcissist will begin scanning their environment for replacements, new individuals who can fulfill a similar function. This is why it is common to see narcissists move on quickly after a relationship ends. It is not necessarily a reflection of emotional recovery, but rather a compensatory mechanism to restore equilibrium. However, if replacement is not immediately successful, or if the previous relationship provided a particularly high level of supply, the narcissist may begin to experience a secondary phase. This phase involves cognitive reevaluation of the past. During this reevaluation, the narcissist does not revisit the relationship in the same way you might. They are not primarily reflecting on emotional harm, empathy, or mutual experiences. Instead, they begin to recognize the functional role you played in their life. They may recall your consistency, your tolerance, your willingness to forgive, and your emotional availability. These memories are filtered through the lens of utility rather than intimacy. This is often the point where people believe the narcissist is finally realizing your worth. While there is some truth to the idea that recognition is occurring, it is important to clarify the nature of that recognition. The narcissist is not necessarily recognizing your intrinsic value as a person in a fully empathetic way. Rather, they are recognizing the loss of a reliable and effective source of supply. This distinction is critical because it explains why apparent change at this stage can be misleading. The narcissist may appear more reflective, more expressive, or even remorseful. They may articulate insights about their behavior or acknowledge mistakes. However, in many cases, these expressions are situational responses to loss, rather than indicators of deep structural change. Personality level change, particularly in narcissistic patterns, requires sustained self-awareness, accountability, and often long-term therapeutic intervention. It is not typically triggered by a single loss event, no matter how significant. For the person who has left, this phase can be particularly dangerous. Observing what appears to be growth or realization can activate hope. There may be a temptation to interpret these signals as evidence that the relationship can now become healthy. However, re-engaging at this point often leads to a reinstatement of the original dynamics because the underlying psychological structure has not fundamentally changed. As time progresses and your absence remains consistent, the narcissist is forced to integrate a new reality. Access to you is no longer available. This is the point at which the realization becomes more concrete. It is no longer a temporary disruption, but a permanent loss of a specific type of supply. At this stage, the narcissist may experience what can be described as a delayed recognition. They understand on a cognitive level that you are a stable and valuable presence in their life. They may even compare you to new individuals and find those new connections lacking in certain ways. However, this realization is often accompanied by a pragmatic rather than emotional conclusion. The resource is gone and cannot be recovered. This is what is meant by "it's too late." It is not a cinematic moment of emotional breakthrough or profound regret. It is a quieter, more detached understanding that something beneficial has been lost due to their inability to maintain it. Meanwhile, your psychological trajectory is moving in a different direction. By maintaining distance and disengagement, you are interrupting the reinforcement cycle that previously kept you attached. Over time, this allows for the rebuilding of self-regulation, self-trust, and personal boundaries. The focus shifts away from the narcissist's behavior and toward your own internal stability. This shift is essential because one of the most persistent cognitive traps after leaving a narcissistic relationship is the need for validation. Questions such as, "Do they miss me?" or "Will they regret losing me?" can keep you psychologically tied to the relationship even in physical absence. However, the more relevant question becomes whether their internal state has any bearing on your recovery. From a clinical perspective, your healing is not dependent on their realization. Whether or not the narcissist fully understands your value does not alter the structural patterns that existed within the relationship. What matters is your ability to recognize those patterns, disengage from them, and establish new relational standards moving forward. In summary, when a narcissist realizes you are gone for good, the process is less about emotional awakening and more about the loss of control and supply. Initial reactions involve confusion and attempts to reestablish access. This may be followed by compensatory behaviors, such as seeking new sources of validation. In some cases, there is a delayed cognitive recognition of your functional value, but this does not necessarily translate into genuine transformation. The concept of too late reflects the timing of this realization. By the time the narcissist fully understands that you are no longer accessible, the relational structure has already collapsed and your psychological detachment has progressed. The window for re-engagement from your side has closed. Ultimately, the most significant outcome is not their realization, but your disengagement. When you reach a point where their perception, regret, or lack thereof no longer influences your sense of self, the dynamic is truly over. At that point, the power that once defined the relationship no longer exists, and what remains is not loss, but autonomy.